The sky was torn apart by a cascade of brilliant light as the first alien warships arrived over Earth's major cities. Massive vessels, each the size of a mountain, descended through the atmosphere, their metallic hulls gleaming under the sun. The world had long speculated about first contact, but this was not the peaceful greeting scientists had dreamed of. These ships were not here to talk. They were here to conquer. Panic spread like wildfire. News channels scrambled to cover the sudden invasion, their broadcasts filled with images of the towering alien crafts hovering over Washington, D.C., London, Beijing, and countless other cities. Fighter jets took to the skies, warships prepared for battle, and armies around the world mobilized, waiting for the inevitable first strike. Humanity had seen this story before, an enemy descending from the stars to claim what was not theirs. Then the message came. It was not a demand, nor a declaration of war, but a simple, chilling statement. We have come to conquer. The words echoed across the world, transmitted through every screen, every radio, every device capable of receiving a signal. The voice was deep, emotionless, carrying the weight of something ancient and powerful. There was no introduction, no explanation, no attempt to negotiate. It was a fact, spoken with absolute certainty. The leaders of Earth, already prepared for the worst, gathered in emergency war rooms. Plans were drawn, battle strategies were finalized, and military commanders braced themselves for the bloodshed that would follow. This was an invasion. There was no other possibility. But then something strange happened. The aliens did not attack. No energy weapons rained down from the sky. No devastating blasts reduced cities to rubble. Instead, the ships descended lower, until they hovered just above the tallest buildings. A deep hum filled the air, resonating through the ground. And then, from the largest vessel, a single structure emerged, a long, sleek ramp stretching down to Earth. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, they stepped out. Tall, armored figures, their bodies encased in dark exoskeletal suits, marched down the ramp in perfect unison. Their helmets concealed their faces, but the sheer precision of their movements spoke of military discipline. They were soldiers, conquerors, and yet they did not raise their weapons. They simply stood there, motionless, waiting. The silence was unbearable. The world braced for violence, but instead of firing, instead of shouting commands, the first of the alien warriors reached up and removed his helmet. He was not monstrous. His skin was a deep shade of blue, his eyes a piercing silver. His face was unreadable, yet there was something oddly hesitant about him. He studied the humans before him as if he, too, was unsure of what would come next. Then, in a voice that carried across the stunned crowds, he repeated the same words. We have come to conquer. And then, humanity did something no species in the galaxy had ever done before. They welcomed their conquerors with open arms. People stepped forward, not with weapons, not with fear, but with curiosity. A woman in a blue dress, her hands trembling but her smile genuine, approached the nearest alien and offered a loaf of bread. A child, barely old enough to understand the gravity of the moment, reached up to touch the armored leg of one of the soldiers. A soldier from the United Nations force lowered his rifle, stepping forward cautiously. "You're here to conquer?" he asked, his voice steady despite the confusion in his eyes. The alien commander nodded once. Yes. The soldier stared at him, then exhaled. With a slow, deliberate motion, he extended a hand. "All right," he said. "Then welcome to Earth." A ripple of shock moved through both human and alien ranks. The Drak'Zor, as they were called, had expected resistance. They had expected war. Instead, they were being offered food, kindness, and something they had never encountered in all their years of conquest: acceptance. The alien commander stiffened. "You do not understand what we are," he said, his voice more uncertain now. The soldier smiled. "And you don't understand what we are." Across the world, similar scenes played out. Humans approached their supposed conquerors not as enemies, but as guests. Some offered meals, others offered conversation. In Paris, an artist began sketching the newcomers with fascination. In Japan, monks invited the alien soldiers to sit in silent meditation. In Brazil, musicians played their instruments, and in the United States, coffee shops handed out drinks as if the invaders were nothing more than new tourists in town. Confusion rippled through the ranks of the Drak'Zor warriors. This was not how a conquest was supposed to unfold. They had prepared for resistance, for desperate last stands, for bloodshed. They had not prepared for this. Deep within the flagship, a high-ranking officer watched the scene with growing unease. This was dangerous. This was wrong. Conquering was not meant to be met with smiles. A silent war began to brew within the ranks of the Drak'Zor, one that had nothing to do with weapons, but with something far more terrifying: doubt. The towering warships remained suspended over Earth's cities, their enormous presence a constant reminder of the invasion that never truly began. The Drak'Zor, a species bred for conquest, stood in stunned silence as the humans continued their baffling display of hospitality. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for battle now found themselves standing awkwardly in the midst of welcoming crowds, their weapons untouched, their war protocols useless. Commander Vrynn, the leader of the Drak'Zor expeditionary force, observed the scene with growing confusion. He had studied countless civilizations before this one, and in every instance the reaction had been the same: fear, violence, submission. But humanity defied expectation. They should have fought. They should have resisted. But instead, they accepted their conquerors without a single drop of blood being spilled. A human man, dressed in civilian clothing, approached Vrynn without hesitation, offering a steaming cup of coffee. His hands were steady, his eyes filled with something Vrynn could not quite understand: genuine curiosity. "Try it," the man said, as if he were offering a drink to a friend rather than an invader. Vrynn hesitated. He had never once considered the possibility of accepting an offering from a species he was meant to subjugate. The very notion felt unnatural, and yet he found his hand reaching out, his fingers wrapping around the small cup. The warmth seeped through his armored gloves, foreign and strangely comforting. The humans around him waited, watching him with eager expressions. Some of his own soldiers looked on as well, their rigid stances betraying their own uncertainty. Slowly, Vrynn raised the cup to his lips and took a cautious sip. Bitterness, heat, a complex mixture of flavors danced across his tongue, unfamiliar yet oddly pleasant. He lowered the cup, glancing at the human before him. "It's an acquired taste," the man said with a grin. Vrynn found himself at a loss for words. He had expected battle cries and desperate pleas for mercy, not smiles and casual conversation. The lack of hostility unsettled him more than any ambush ever could. The other Drak'Zor warriors remained motionless, their postures stiff, their minds struggling to process the shift in reality. They had been trained to subdue and dominate, to see weakness in compassion. Yet here they stood, witnessing a species that refused to see them as oppressors. Reports from across the planet came in swiftly. In some regions, humans offered food. In others, they shared stories, music, and traditions. Some had even begun teaching the Drak'Zor their languages, as if the visitors were not invaders, but new neighbors settling in. And then something unprecedented happened. Some of the younger Drak'Zor warriors, those who had not yet been hardened by centuries of war, began to engage. They accepted the food, sat with the humans, listened to their songs. The barriers of fear and expectation started to erode, but not all of them. Deep within the fleet, a different kind of discussion was taking place. General Kor, a high-ranking Drak'Zor officer and a staunch believer in their empire's ways, watched the reports with growing disgust. He had fought in more wars than he could count, crushed entire civilizations beneath his command. And now, he was witnessing the greatest humiliation his people had ever faced. Not because of defeat, but because of inaction. This is a disgrace. He spat, his fists clenched as he turned to his fellow officers. We came here as conquerors, yet we stand idle while these creatures make fools of us. A lower-ranking officer shifted uncomfortably. They are not what we expected. Their response is illogical. Kor's eyes narrowed. It is weakness disguised as kindness, and weakness must be eradicated. The room fell silent. Kor stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. The humans believe they can manipulate us with their hospitality. They believe they can turn warriors into pets, but they underestimate us. They do not realize that mercy is not in our nature. A murmur of agreement spread through the war-hardened officers. They had spent their entire lives believing in the strength of their empire, in the superiority of their kind. And yet now, they saw fellow soldiers hesitating, their convictions crumbling under the weight of human acceptance. It was an infection, one that threatened the very core of what it meant to be Drak'Zor. We must remind them who we are. Kor continued, his voice a low growl. We must force them to fight. Only then will we see their true nature. A younger officer hesitated, but if they do not fight back, if they continue to embrace us, then we make them fight. Kor interrupted, his tone final. We burn their cities. We take their leaders. We remind them that peace is a lie. Silence hung heavy in the air. Then, slowly, one by one, the officers nodded. A plan was set in motion. Meanwhile, on the surface, Vrynn stood among humans who laughed and spoke as if they had already won some unseen war. He watched as a young girl handed one of his soldiers a small, colorful flower. The warrior, a fierce fighter who had once taken down entire squadrons, looked at the fragile thing in his hand as if it were more dangerous than any blade. Vrynn felt something stir within him, a whisper of doubt, a crack in the foundation of everything he had been taught. Perhaps conquest was not about strength. Perhaps true power lay in something far greater than fear. He did not know it yet, but the greatest battle of his life had already begun. And it was not a war against humanity. It was a war against the very beliefs that had shaped him. The atmosphere aboard the Drak'Zor flagship was thick with tension, an invisible storm brewing just beneath the surface. Though the warship still hung over Earth's cities, unmoving and silent, a deeper conflict had already begun, one that would not be fought with weapons, but with ideology. Commander Vrynn walked through the halls of the great vessel, his mind heavy with conflict. The reports from the surface disturbed him in ways he could not fully understand. His soldiers were beginning to change. He had seen it with his own eyes. Warriors who had once stood unshaken in the face of war now hesitated, their rigid beliefs cracking under the weight of human kindness. Some of them had even begun removing their helmets, an act unheard of in an occupation campaign. Others had sat with humans, shared meals, and listened to their stories. Vrynn himself could not deny what he had seen. The child offering a flower, the civilians treating their supposed conquerors as honored guests, the sheer absurdity of a species that refused to resist. The humans should have been cowering, broken, desperate for mercy. Instead, they welcomed their invaders as if they were long-lost friends. And the worst part was that it was working. The Drak'Zor were a species that thrived on war. Their empire had expanded across countless star systems through sheer dominance. And yet, here they were, trapped in a battle they could not even define. There were no battle lines, no grand strategies, no cities burning in defiance. The humans had disarmed them without firing a single shot. A part of Vrynn resented it. Another part of him, one that had been buried deep beneath years of training, wondered if this was what peace felt like. The door to the war chamber hissed open, and Vrynn was immediately met with the cold, calculating gaze of General Kor. The older warrior stood rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes burning with barely contained fury. Around him, several high-ranking officers sat, their expressions grim. "You have allowed weakness to fester," Kor said, his voice sharp as a blade. "This situation on the surface is an embarrassment to our kind." Vrynn said nothing at first, merely stepping forward to stand across from the general. He had expected this confrontation. He had seen it coming from the moment the first Drak'Zor soldier hesitated to raise his weapon. "They are not what we expected," Vrynn admitted. "They are pathetic," Kor snapped, "and we are allowing their disease to spread among our own." Vrynn narrowed his eyes. "What would you have me do? Order our forces to slaughter civilians? To burn a planet that has offered us nothing but hospitality?" "Yes," Kor said without hesitation, "because that is what they deserve." The room fell silent. Kor stepped forward, his towering presence radiating authority. "You do not see what they are doing, Commander. They are stripping us of our identity. They are poisoning our soldiers with their softness. Do you not see how many of our warriors have already faltered? They have lost their edge, lost their purpose. Soon, they will no longer be Drak'Zor. They will be something else, something lesser." Vrynn clenched his fists. He wanted to deny it, to push back against Kor's words, but the truth was far more complicated. He had seen his own troops questioning their purpose. He had seen them struggle with emotions they had never been taught to process. And yet, he did not see it as a weakness. "Perhaps," Vrynn said carefully, "it is not that we are losing our identity. Perhaps we are discovering a new one." Kor's eyes darkened with rage. "You would throw away centuries of conquest. You would allow our people to be reduced to mere guests in a world that should belong to us." "I am saying that we should consider another path," Vrynn replied. "One where we do not need to conquer to be strong." Kor exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disgust. "You have already fallen, Commander. But I will not allow this disease to consume our empire." Vrynn stiffened. "What are you planning?" Kor stepped back, his lips curling into something dangerously close to a smirk. "You will see soon enough." Before Vrynn could respond, the general turned sharply and exited the room, his officers following close behind. The door sealed behind them, leaving Vrynn alone with his thoughts. A cold realization settled in his chest. Kor was not going to wait for humanity to fight back. He was going to force their hand. Down on the surface, the humans were blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. In the streets, Drak'Zor warriors moved cautiously among the people, some still wary, others already softened by the strange warmth they found in this alien world. In one sector, a group of soldiers had been invited into a human home, sitting stiffly around a wooden dining table as an elderly woman served them warm bread and soup. The concept of sharing a meal as equals was foreign to them, but some had begun to eat, uncertain but willing. In another part of the city, a human engineer demonstrated a piece of technology to a young Drak'Zor recruit, explaining the intricacies of human innovation. The recruit listened, fascinated. It was in these small moments that the tide of the war, not a war of weapons, but of ideology, was turning. But Kor would not let it continue. The first attack came without warning. Explosions erupted across the city's outskirts. Fires spread rapidly, consuming buildings and homes. The sky, once filled with the silent presence of alien ships, now burned with streaks of plasma fire. Panic spread. The humans, caught off guard, scrambled for cover. Some screamed, others ran, their expressions a mixture of shock and betrayal. The very people who had welcomed the Drak'Zor with open arms were now being torn apart by their unexpected violence. Vrynn watched from the flagship, his heart hammering in his chest. Kor had done it. He had turned peace into war. But Vrynn knew something that Kor did not. The humans were not weak. And they were not defenseless. The true battle was about to begin. And this time, it would not be fought on the terms of the Drak'Zor alone. The first explosion ripped through the outskirts of the city, sending a shockwave through the streets. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the scent of burning metal and scorched earth filled the air. The humans, who had been living alongside the Drak'Zor with open arms, now ran in terror as fire and destruction rained down upon them. Panic spread quickly. Mothers grabbed their children, shopkeepers abandoned their businesses, and soldiers who had once stood side by side with their alien visitors now scrambled to protect their own people. The Drak'Zor warriors who had begun to integrate into human society turned sharply toward the sky, their instincts screaming at them to act. Vrynn stood frozen aboard the flagship, his eyes locked on the carnage below. He could barely comprehend what he was seeing. Moments ago, this had been a city of peace, a place where the impossible had happened, where an invading force had been met with kindness instead of war. And now, it was burning. A deep voice cut through the silence of the command deck. This is how it should have been from the beginning. Vrynn turned sharply to find General Kor standing beside him, his expression devoid of emotion. His eyes, however, burned with cold satisfaction. "You did this," Vrynn growled, his fists clenching at his sides. Kor did not deny it. He merely folded his hands behind his back, watching the destruction unfold. "I did what needed to be done. These humans have weakened our soldiers, poisoned our minds with their pathetic ideals of peace. They needed to be reminded of who we are." Vrynn's pulse pounded in his ears. They were never a threat to us. They welcomed us. They mocked us, Kor interrupted, turning to face him. "Every time one of our warriors accepted their food, their kindness, their foolish words of friendship, we lost our strength. We are not meant to coexist, Vrynn. We are meant to conquer. And if they will not fight us willingly, we will force them to." A sick realization settled in Vrynn's chest. This was not about humans. This was about control. Kor had seen the cracks forming within their own ranks. He had seen Drak'Zor warriors beginning to question everything they had been taught. And instead of allowing that change to take root, he had chosen to burn it down before it could spread. Vrynn took a step forward. "You think this will make them afraid of us? That they will bow down and submit?" Kor smiled coldly. "Fear is the most powerful weapon in the universe, Commander. And I will remind them of that." But Vrynn knew Kor had made a grave mistake. The humans were not afraid. Down below, chaos reigned. The initial attack had been swift, calculated to cause maximum destruction. But the response came just as fast. Sirens wailed through the streets as human forces mobilized, soldiers taking up defensive positions, civilians helping one another to safety. The Drak'Zor who had already begun to integrate into human society found themselves at a crossroads. Fight alongside the people who had shown them kindness, or remain loyal to an empire that had betrayed its own word. Vrynn could see the hesitation in their movements. Some of his warriors rushed toward the destruction, not to aid in the assault but to protect the humans caught in the crossfire. Others turned on their own kind, shouting in their native tongue, demanding answers, demanding why. And then the counterattack began. Humans had never been ones to go down quietly. Even in their darkest moments, they had always found ways to fight back. But this was different. They had already proven they could outthink their enemies, that they could turn conquerors into guests. Now, they would prove that they were not weak. The first strike came not from weapons, but from information. Within moments, the world's networks were filled with broadcasts showing the truth. Drak'Zor soldiers eating meals with humans, warriors accepting gifts from children, officers standing among the people as equals. These were not images of war. They were images of peace, of unity, of something greater than conquest. And it spread. The Drak'Zor homeworld, light years away, received the broadcasts. The Empire saw not images of a glorious invasion, but of warriors who had found something worth more than war. Civil unrest began to bubble as citizens questioned everything they had been told about their mission, about their purpose. And on Earth, the resistance hardened. Human engineers had already studied the Drak'Zor's technology in the days since their arrival, fascinated by their ships, their weapons, their armor. And now, that knowledge became their greatest weapon. Within hours, human scientists developed countermeasures, jamming communication networks, scrambling targeting systems, and rendering some of the Drak'Zor's most advanced war machines useless. Vrynn saw it all happening, and in that moment, he realized the truth. Kor had doomed them. By forcing this war, he had given humanity exactly what they needed, a reason to fight back. Vrynn's hands clenched at his sides. He had been silent for too long. He had allowed this madness to unfold, hoping that somehow it would resolve itself. But now, there was no more time for hesitation. He turned on Kor, his voice like steel. "You've lost." Kor chuckled darkly. "Lost? We have just begun." Vrynn stepped closer. "You don't see it yet, do you? We were winning before you did this. We had already conquered them, not with war, but with something far greater. They were welcoming us. They were letting us into their world. And you destroyed it." Kor's expression flickered, just for a second. "They were making us weak." Vrynn shook his head. "No, they were making us better. And you couldn't stand it." A sudden blast rocked the flagship, and alarms blared through the halls. A soldier ran in, his face pale with shock. "Sir, human forces are pushing back. They've—" He hesitated, eyes darting between Vrynn and Kor. "They've disabled several of our weapon systems, and some of our own forces. They're refusing to fight." Vrynn felt a flicker of hope. Kor, however, seethed with rage. "Then we will crush them with whatever we have left." Vrynn took a slow breath. He had made his decision. In one swift motion, he drew his sidearm and leveled it at Kor. The room froze. Kor stared at him, disbelief flickering in his cold, dark eyes. "You would betray your own kind." Vrynn's grip did not waver. "I am protecting my kind. And if you cannot see that, then you are already lost." The officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. The division that had been growing among the Drak'Zor was now in full bloom. Some stood beside Kor, unwilling to let go of the Empire's ways. But others, more than Vrynn expected, stepped back, uncertainty in their expressions. Vrynn's voice was calm, steady. "Surrender, General. This war ends now." Kor's lips curled into a snarl. "You are a fool, Vrynn." He lunged. Vrynn fired. The shot rang out through the command deck, and in that moment, the tides of the war changed. It was no longer about conquest. It was about the future of two species, and the choice of what kind of warriors they would become. Kor's body hit the cold metal floor, his expression frozen in shock. The shot had been precise. Vrynn had aimed for a non-lethal wound, striking just above his armor plating. But even as the general gasped in pain, gripping his side, the damage had already been done. The room was silent, every officer present staring at the fallen warlord. The divide among the Drak'Zor was no longer a whisper behind closed doors. It was now written in blood. Vrynn kept his weapon raised, his gaze sweeping across the command deck. He could feel the tension thick in the air. Some of the officers still loyal to Kor shifted uneasily, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Others, those who had already begun questioning the path of conquest, hesitated, their eyes flickering between Kor and Vrynn. It was now or never. This war was never ours to fight. Vrynn said, his voice calm but firm. "You all saw it. You all felt it. The humans did not resist us. They did not fight us. They welcomed us, and we repaid them with fire." Kor coughed, blood staining his lips as he glared up at Vrynn. "You are a coward," he spat. "You let them infect you." Vrynn's grip on his weapon tightened. "No," he said, "I saw the truth. We are not invincible. We are not gods. For the first time in our history, we had a chance to be more than conquerors, and you destroyed that chance." One of the officers, a hardened veteran named Saltor, took a step forward. His armor was scorched from battles across the galaxy, and his face was lined with the scars of war. He had been loyal to Kor from the beginning. But now he looked down at his fallen commander, uncertainty clouding his fierce yellow eyes. "We are Drak'Zor," Saltor said slowly. "We have always known war. It is what we are." Vrynn lowered his weapon slightly. "And what if we could be more? What if we could build something instead of destroy it? The humans have shown us a different path. Kor let out a ragged laugh, still clutching his wound. You think they will forgive us? After what we have done, they will never trust us again. Vrynn turned to the viewport, looking down at Earth. Smoke still rose from the cities, but the humans had not been broken. If anything, they had only grown stronger. Even now, they were rebuilding, fighting back in ways the Drak'Zor had not expected. Not through sheer force, but through strategy, through unity. They had found allies among the very people who were sent to conquer them. Vrynn faced the room again. We have a choice. We can continue this war and be remembered as nothing more than invaders, or we can end it now and prove that we are more than our past. Silence. Then, Zaltor took a slow breath and unclipped the rifle from his back. He set it down on the table. I will not fight this war anymore. A ripple went through the room. One by one, the officers followed his lead, placing their weapons aside. Vrynn looked down at Kor. It's over. Kor's breathing was ragged, his body weakened by the wound, but his eyes still burned with defiance. It will never be over. You think the Empire will allow this? You think they will accept this? Surrender. Vrynn stared at him. It's not surrender, he said. It's survival. With a sharp motion, he turned to the communications officer. Patch me through to the human leaders. We need to talk. The officer hesitated for only a moment before nodding and activating the long-range transmission system. A holographic screen flickered to life, and a human general appeared. A stern-faced woman with piercing brown eyes and a uniform adorned with medals. Her expression was unreadable. Vrynn took a deep breath. This is Commander Vrynn of the Drak'Zor fleet. I am ordering a ceasefire. The human general did not react immediately. Behind her, the war room was alive with activity. Officers rushing to update battle plans, screens displaying live feeds of the conflict. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, wary. Why should we believe you? Vrynn exhaled. Because I am done fighting a war that never should have happened. There was a long pause. Then, the general leaned forward slightly. And what about the ones who started it? Vrynn glanced at Kor. The once feared general was still slumped on the ground, his breath shallow. They are no longer in command, Vrynn said simply. The general studied him carefully. Then, to his surprise, she gave a small nod. Then let's talk. The screen went dark. Vrynn turned back to the officers. Inform the fleet. Stand down. No more attacks. The room moved into action. Messages were sent. Orders relayed. Across the Drak'Zor fleet, warships powered down their weapons, their positions shifting from attack formations to neutral stances. On the ground, soldiers who had once been ordered to dominate now found themselves standing side by side with humans, uncertain but willing to see what came next. It was not over. The damage had been done. Trust had been shattered. But there was a chance, a fragile, delicate chance, that something new could be built in its place. Vrynn knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be those among the Drak'Zor who would resist this change. The Empire would not accept this without a fight, and the humans would not forget the destruction they had suffered. But for the first time, Vrynn did not feel like a conqueror. He felt like something else, something better. The war had ended, but the battle for the future had only begun. Across the cities of Earth, the fires still burned, smoke drifting into the sky like a reminder of the destruction that had nearly consumed both species. The Drak'Zor warships, once symbols of impending doom, now hung motionless over the planet, their weapons powered down, their soldiers standing in uneasy silence. Vrynn had given the order. The fleet had stood down, but that did not mean the war was forgotten. In the heart of the human capital, Vrynn stood before a gathering of Earth's leaders. The room was filled with military officials, politicians, and commanders who had spent the last days preparing for the worst. Now they faced their former enemy, waiting for answers. The human general, the one Vrynn had spoken to before, met his gaze with sharp, assessing eyes. Her name was General Alden, and from the way she carried herself, Vrynn could tell she was not one to be easily deceived. "You claim this war is over," Alden said, her voice calm but firm. "Yet your ships still darken our skies. Your soldiers still walk our streets. Why should we believe this is anything more than a temporary pause?" Vrynn clasped his hands behind his back. He had expected this response. The humans had every right to be suspicious. After all, they had opened their arms to the Drak'Zor, and in return, they had been betrayed. "The war is over," Vrynn said evenly. "But the damage cannot be undone in a single day. I do not ask for trust. I only ask for the chance to earn it." Alden did not flinch. "And what about those among your own people who do not agree with you?" That was the real question. Not all of the Drak'Zor had accepted Vrynn's choice. While many had begun to question the path of conquest, others still clung to their old beliefs. Kor had not been the only one who wanted war. He had simply been the first to act. There were others, officers, soldiers, even high-ranking officials back on the Drak'Zor homeworld, who would see Vrynn's decision as treason. And they would not stay silent for long. "There will be resistance," Vrynn admitted. "There will be those who refuse to accept peace, but they no longer command this fleet, and if they try to reignite this war, I will stand against them." Alden studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then you have one chance." The meeting continued for hours. Terms were discussed, agreements negotiated. The humans were cautious, unwilling to lower their defenses too soon, but they were also pragmatic. They understood that not all Drak'Zor were responsible for the attack, just as Vrynn understood that not all humans would be willing to forgive. Outside, in the war-torn streets, the uneasy coexistence between humans and Drak'Zor continued. Some humans had taken it upon themselves to help the wounded Drak'Zor, despite everything that had happened. Others were not so forgiving. There were standoffs, arguments, fights breaking out between those who saw the aliens as potential allies and those who saw them as nothing more than invaders who had not yet been driven off the planet. And in the shadows, whispers of rebellion grew. Deep within the flagship, a small group of officers gathered in secrecy. They had once followed Kor, and though their leader had fallen, their beliefs had not died with him. "We should never have stopped the invasion," one of them snarled. "This planet should have been ours by now." "We were betrayed," another growled. "By our own commander, no less." "Vrynn is a fool," the first officer hissed, "and fools do not deserve to lead." A heavy silence filled the room. Then one of them stepped forward, eyes cold with purpose. "Then we take back control. And this time, we do not hesitate." The seeds of mutiny had been planted. Back on the surface, Vrynn stood on the edge of a ruined street, watching as a group of humans rebuilt what had been lost. The destruction left behind by the attack was severe, but the humans did not linger in grief. They worked together, lifting broken beams, clearing rubble, tending to the wounded. Even in the face of devastation, they endured. It was something Vrynn had never seen before. Not in all the worlds the Drak'Zor had conquered. Other species had crumbled under the weight of defeat, had bowed before the might of an invading force. But humans did not break. They adapted. They resisted in ways that went beyond warfare. "You're watching them like they're a mystery," a voice said beside him. Vrynn turned to see one of his own soldiers standing there. The warrior had removed his helmet, revealing deep-set amber eyes and dark gray skin lined with scars. His name was Ralvik, one of the younger recruits who had first stepped onto human soil expecting battle, and had instead found something entirely different. "They are a mystery," Vrynn admitted. Ralvik was silent for a moment, watching as a human woman passed out food to both her own people and the Drak'Zor who had chosen to stand beside them. "Do you think they'll ever forgive us?" he asked. Vrynn exhaled slowly. "Some will, some never will, and we have to live with that." Ralvik nodded, but there was something in his expression, an understanding that had not been there before. "They changed us," Ralvik said. Without even trying, they changed us. Vrynn looked out over the city, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. The war was over, but the real fight, the fight for what came next, had only just begun. And he knew, without a doubt, that the greatest battle would not be against humanity. It would be against his own kind. The night sky over Earth remained stained with the presence of the Drak'Zor fleet, their warships no longer looming as a threat, but instead as a reminder of the uneasy truce that had settled over the planet. The fires from the attack had been extinguished, but the scars remained, scars that would not easily fade from memory. Cities stood half-ruined, streets lined with wreckage, and yet humanity did what it had always done. They rebuilt. They endured. Vrynn stood atop a crumbling skyscraper, looking over the city below. What had once been a battleground was now a place of hesitant cooperation. Drak'Zor warriors moved through the streets, some working alongside humans to clear debris, others standing uncertainly at the edges of the crowds, still struggling with their place in this new world. The ones who had chosen peace had begun adapting, learning human customs, eating human food, listening to their strange, vibrant music. But the battle was not over. Deep within the flagship, the mutiny had begun. The remnants of Corps' loyalists moved quickly, seizing control of key sections of the ship. They worked in the shadows, disabling security systems, taking out those who stood in their way. Their plan was simple: overthrow Vrynn, take back command of the fleet, and finish what had been started. The leader of the rebellion, a ruthless officer named Zarek, had always been a true believer in the Drak'Zor Empire. He had watched in disgust as their warriors mingled with humans, their once proud soldiers reduced to little more than confused children playing at peace. It was a disgrace. This was never meant to be, Zarek growled as he gathered his forces in the lower deck. We were not sent here to make friends. We were sent to claim this world. And now, our commander has turned against everything we stand for. The soldiers surrounding him nodded in agreement, their eyes hard with resolve. They had been raised on the belief that the strong must rule, that conquest was the natural order of the universe. To abandon that was to abandon everything that made them Drak'Zor. We take back the ship, Zarek continued. We send a message to the Empire. And we finish this war. They moved quickly. Weapons were distributed, battle strategies formed. The halls of the flagship, once silent, soon echoed with the sounds of conflict as the rebels clashed with those still loyal to Vrynn. Vrynn was already waiting for them. He had known this was coming. From the moment Kor had fallen, from the moment he had chosen peace, he had known that there would be those who would not accept it. The Drak'Zor had lived by the sword for too long, and for some, letting go of that was unthinkable. When the alarms blared, signaling the internal attack, Vrynn and his most trusted warriors moved swiftly. The corridors of the flagship became a battlefield, the rebellion tearing through the ship with calculated precision. Blaster fire lit up the darkness. Vrynn fought with the same skill that had made him one of the Drak'Zor's greatest commanders. But this was not a battle against enemies. This was a battle against his own people, against those who could not see that there was another way. Ralvik fought beside him, his movements sharp and efficient. "They're pushing toward the control room," he shouted over the gunfire. Vrynn gritted his teeth. "Then we stopped them." They pushed forward, cutting through the ranks of the rebels, but the enemy was relentless. Zarek's forces had the advantage. They were fighting for the old ways, for the empire they believed had been betrayed. They were willing to die before they accepted peace. The final battle came in the command center. Zarek stood at the helm, his soldiers guarding the entrance. He turned as Vrynn entered, a slow smirk forming on his face. "You should have killed Kor when you had the chance," Zarek said. "Mercy is weakness, and now it will cost you everything." Vrynn did not waste time with words. He lunged. The fight was brutal. Blows landed with bone-crushing force. Weapons clashed. Sparks flew as steel met steel. Zarek fought like a man possessed, his movements fueled by rage. by the belief that he was restoring what had been lost. But Vrynn was not the same warrior he had been before coming to Earth. He had seen something greater than conquest. He had seen the power of resilience, of unity, of a species that could survive even in the face of overwhelming odds. And he had learned from them. With one final strike, Vrynn sent Zarek crashing to the ground. Blood dripped from his wounds, but he did not move to finish the kill. Zarek glared up at him. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "The Empire will never accept this. Even if you win today, they will come. They will burn this world to the ground." Vrynn stared down at him. "Then let them come," he said, "and they will see that we are no longer their pawns." He turned to the remaining rebels. "Surrender," he ordered. "This fight is over." One by one, the remaining soldiers hesitated. Then, slowly, they dropped their weapons. It was over. The rebellion had failed. But Zarek's words still lingered in Vrynn's mind. The Empire would not forget this. There would be consequences. In the days that followed, the humans and Drak'Zor worked together to rebuild what had been lost. Trust was slow to return, but it was there, fragile as glass, but growing stronger with each passing day. Some Drak'Zor chose to stay on Earth, integrating into human society. Others prepared to leave, to carry the message back to the Empire that things had changed. Vrynn stood before General Alden, both leaders now standing not as enemies, but as something closer to allies. "What happens next?" Alden asked. Vrynn exhaled. "We prepare," he said simply, "because when the Empire comes, we will show them that we are stronger than they ever believed." Alden studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she offered a small, knowing smile. "Then we fight together." And for the first time in history, an empire built on war had been defeated not by destruction, but by something far greater. By humanity. By unity. By hope.